Okay, everyone, welcome to our video for topic 4.7, which is about the expansion of democracy in the early 1800s. And what we're really going to be looking at is the shift from Jeffersonian democracy to Jacksonian democracy. So we see here Jackson. This is for Andrew Jackson. So what you might see as you read is this is called the Age of Jackson, or Jacksonian democracy, or you often can see it called the era of the common man, because what we see is that political participation in the United States greatly expanded in this time period. If we are tracing the expansion of the right to vote in the United States, this is the time period where white men gained the right to vote independent of property, for example. So we're seeing an expansion of suffrage or voting. So let's take a look at what's going on in this time period. We're going to be talking about presidential elections here. And the most important one we're looking at right now for this video is the election of 1824. Now, this is a very contentious election in our history. This is a disputed election. This is one where the outcome is questionable. So it's definitely an important one to remember. This is a lot like the election of 1800, where you need to be able to describe some of what was going on around the election. So what we have here is Andrew Jackson, and I will have an image of him in a little bit. But Andrew Jackson is running for president against 4 other men. So there are 5 people seeking the presidency. So what we have is Henry Clay, a congressman from Kentucky, and he is very important. He is someone that we will hear about a number of times throughout these next few videos. Okay, he ultimately is going to run for the presidency 3 times. He's going to lose every time, not because he's a bad politician. His timing's just off. So he's a very important politician in American history. Okay, we also have John Quincy Adams, who is the son of President John Adams, our second president. He's from Massachusetts. And then we have John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. And he's another one that is very important. We're going to hear a lot about him. And then William Crawford from Georgia. This is like the only time he's going to come up, and he really was kind of a non-player in this election. So let's see what happens here. They run against each other. And I'm actually going to close my video for this one so that it's not sitting over the slides. So we end up really with an election that's between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. So we are looking at the map here, and you can see, Henry Clay does get some electoral votes here. He's 37. William Crawford got 41. So both of them are clearly losers in this election. And then we have John Quincy Adams with 84 electoral votes and Andrew Jackson with 99. So when we're looking at the numbers here at the bottom of the slide, it definitely appears like Jackson has won, right? He won the highest number of votes. He won the highest number of electoral college votes. However, the Constitution says to become president, you have to win a majority of the electoral votes. So if we add up the column on electoral votes, there are 261 electoral votes. And so to win the presidency, you need 131 to win. So this is kind of like the election of 1800 when Jefferson and Burr tied in the Electoral College and it had to go to the House of Representatives. This election was sent to the House of Representatives to be decided, but because no candidate had the necessary majority of the electoral votes, right? So did not receive a majority of the electoral votes. And so one very interesting thing we're going to find in the next few slides is that Henry Clay has a lot of sway in the House of Representatives. So it's clear he's lost, but he gets to have a large say of what's going on. So there is an accusation on the part of Jackson in this election that Henry Clay is pictured here, made a bargain with John Quincy Adams, pictured here, to put John Quincy Adams into the presidency. So he called it a corrupt bargain. So what I want you to do is see if you think there was a corrupt bargain going on. Okay, so Henry Clay gives his support to John Adams, and the House of Representatives ends up choosing Adams as the president. Okay, and 2 weeks later, John Adams appointed Henry Clay as his Secretary of State. And at this time, Secretary of State was considered a stepping stone into the presidency. So this is where Jackson begins to say, wait a minute, it seems to me like maybe there was a bargain here going on. So Jackson calls it the corrupt bargain, and we don't know exactly what happened. We can only consult primary sources and try to find out. But so I'll share with some of those with you. But Jackson promises after this happens that he is going to run again for the presidency in 1828, and that he is going to smash Adams in that election of 1828. Okay, so here's what the historical record kind of says about the corrupt bargain. So the suspicions have been strengthened as people study the diary of John Quincy Adams. So there isn't a lot written down. I mean, when politicians make deals like this, they usually don't put them in writing. So on January 1st, 1825, in John Adams' diary, after a public dinner, he wrote, "He," meaning Clay, "told me in a whisper that he should be glad to have with me soon some confidential conversation upon public affairs. I said I should be happy to have it whenever it might suit his convenience." Okay, and then later in the diary on January 9th, it says, "Mr. Clay came at 6 and spent the evening with me in a long conversation, explanatory of the past and prospective of the future." And exactly 1 month later, with Clay's backing, Adams was elected. So this happens because Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House. And also, these two men hated Andrew Jackson. So the question of, was there a corrupt bargain? I'm going to guess probably, because it is politics, and that's what politicians tend to do. Right? So they don't like Andrew Jackson. They're going to then make a decision that is most tenable to them. So this causes a little bit of an uproar in the in the political system. So up to this point, not really up to this point, but during the presidency of James Monroe, which ended in 1825 when John Quincy Adams became president. During that presidency, that's the time period we call the era of good feelings, where we only have one political party. Everybody was a member of the Democratic Republicans. But there were still disagreements within the party. So following the election of 1824, we begin to see splits in the party. And this is where we start to say Jacksonian democracy is beginning. So we see this split where we have a group called the National Republicans. So they use the Republican label from Democratic Republicans. This includes John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and Daniel Webster. They favored a strong national government. They favor things like the Bank of the United States, protective tariffs, internal improvements. They favor laws that will help industry. They want to establish public schools, and they favor moral reforms such as prohibition or the abolition of slavery. And so this group right here is, they're kind of the replacement to the Federalists, but this name is not going to stick around, right? What we're seeing here is a transition period where American political parties are moving from what we call the first party system, which is the Democratic Republicans versus the Federalists, into the second party system, which will eventually be the Whigs versus the Democrats. And so this party, the National Republicans, they are going to become the Whigs. So they're if we're tracing political parties, it would have gone Federalists to National Republicans to the Whigs. And so this name here, you don't totally have to remember because it's only around for about 4 years, but we're watching parties in flux and transition. Okay, the other party, oh, sorry. I didn't have that key there. Okay, the other party is the Democrats. So this name is going to stick around even into today because we still have the Democratic Party. And the Democrats were made up of people like Jackson and Calhoun. They believe in states' rights and in federal restraint in economic and social affairs. So what this means when we say federal restraint is they argue small government. And they favor the liberty of the individual, and they're fiercely on guard against any inroads of privilege into the government. So they don't want to see a return of like an aristocracy, for example. And so this is the party that would want to protect the common man. So this is important as we're talking about this expanding democracy, because this is the era of the common man. We're going to see expansion of political participation. Okay, so John Quincy Adams is president, and what's really interesting here is he's only a one-term president, and there's not a lot that we have to remember about his presidency because it's dominated by this like rancor and change in political parties, and then he wasn't reelected, and so Jackson becomes the most important figure. So when we're looking at Andrew Jackson, here is a young Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans. But he's born 1767, somewhere around the border of North and South Carolina. Nobody's really 100% sure. It's, records weren't kept quite so easily. His father dies before his birth, and he's raised by his mother. Okay, and his mother is an important person in his life. We'll kind of talk a little bit about it. But when he was a young man, one of the things that he did or is known for is that he read a copy of the Declaration of Independence to the townspeople who were illiterate. And he was quite inspired by that document. And then during the Revolutionary War, there was, his mother she died. And he blamed the British soldiers for his mother's death. She wasn't killed by British soldiers. She became ill after nursing some British soldiers. So he hated the British. He blamed them for the death of his mother and brother. And then, what he finds is that at 13 years old, he is an orphan. And, he's someone who was hungry for information, but didn't have the money to pay for schooling. So he is a self-educated individual. He has no formal education. And he did not care for President Washington. He thought President Washington was too moderate, not decisive enough. He called George Washington an aristo, which is short for aristocrat. So he saw him as upper class, wealthy, and elitist. So we can see even as a young man, Jackson was, he was a common man. So you can see my thought bubble here. Jackson appeals to the common man because he was a common man. He comes from that background of he did not have privilege and wealth in his background. So he's the first president from the West. In fact, Andrew Jackson is the first president in the United States who is not from either Virginia or Massachusetts. So he's the first president from the West, from Tennessee. And so this is a new state that wasn't one of the 13 colonies. Okay, as far as Jackson, the man goes, if we look to the former champion of the common man, Thomas Jefferson, in 1824, Thomas Jefferson said of Jackson, "When I was president of the Senate, he was a senator, and he could never speak on account of the rashness of his feelings. I have seen him attempt it repeatedly, and is often choked with rage. His passions are no doubt cooler now, but he is a dangerous man." So Andrew Jackson made the political elite nervous because he didn't really want to fall in line with the political elite. He represented change, but it was unpredictable change. So that's one of the reasons why we see a little bit of pushback in the time period against Jackson amongst that political elite. So when we get to the election of 1828, we see again a repeat of the election of 1824 in a sense. It is Andrew Jackson versus John Quincy Adams. And it was a very, very dirty, nasty campaign. Okay, so there were all kinds of accusations in the paper by surrogates of these men. And what that means is people who represent them. So some of the things we see, for example, in an anti-Jackson newspaper, General Jackson's mother was a common prostitute brought to this country by the British soldiers. She afterwards married a mulatto man with whom she had several children, of which one was Andrew Jackson. And this is an unfounded accusation. But if we think of the time period, number one, on a personal level, Jackson did not tolerate people insulting the women in his life, right? So this is an insult to Jackson's mother. And then this accusation of his mother marrying a mulatto man and having several children would mean that Jackson was mixed race, which in that time period would disqualify Andrew Jackson from becoming the president at all. So that's one accusation. In response, the anti-Jackson's people or anti-Adams people accused John Quincy Adams of hiring a servant girl for a visiting Russian ambassador. So they were accusing him basically of being a pimp or something. This is nasty stuff going on in this presidential election. Okay, so it's considered one of the worst in U.S. history for its mudslinging, for its negative attack politics. Now, you can see on my slide, it says the American tragedy. Let me make sure I don't have, there we go. One event that occurred during this election is that Jackson's wife, Rachel, died of a heart attack right before he became the president. Now, she could have been in ill health and had a problem with her heart already, but Jackson blamed this on Adams and Clay. He believed this negative politics was a result of, these negative politics on the part of Adams and Clay resulted in the death of his wife. So he held a personal grudge against them. But what we see when we look at the results of the actual election is that in this instance, Jackson won handily, right? So same situation in terms of electoral votes, needed 131. Jackson won 178. So why such a difference in the elections just 4 years apart? Well, population shifts to the western states and the South gave the common man more political power. So we've had more people moving into western states and southern states. Additionally, more men can vote in 1828 than they could in 1824. And the question is why? Because property restrictions to vote had been dropped in a number of states. So the very different outcome in this election. So we're looking right here and you can see, like we've seen this slide before, but we can see the difference in who's eligible to vote. So in 1800, we have this map on the right. You had to be 21 years old, you had to be educated, and you had to be a property owner to be able to vote, right? So that's going to restrict the number of people who can actually participate in the political system. Now, jumping forward to 1830, you can see a very different outcome. So a lot of the states have turned from green with a property qualification to either red, you got to pay taxes, or this yellow color, you can vote. All you have to do is be male and over the age of 21. So this is not new information to us, but we do see a change in democracy because of this. So all of this additional participation is going to change the political system. So we shift from Jeffersonian democracy, when people should be governed as little as possible, to Jacksonian democracy, where whatever governing needed to be done should be done by the common man. So government by the majority of the people instead of government governed by the upper class was introduced during Jackson's presidency. Okay, so what we see during Jacksonian democracy, again, no property ownership to vote, a growth of political power of the working class, an increased number of elected officials, land is easy to get out west, and the ideas of the Declaration of Independence becomes important, and people begin to see inequalities in society. So we will address this a little bit in future videos, specifically in our topic 411. But what we see change in the electoral process then from 1790 to 1820 is there used to be a caucus that would choose a candidate. So a small group of individuals who are political elites would choose who was going to run for presidency from political parties. This was called the King Caucus. Now, in 1828, we see political parties switch to a convention where members of the political parties can nominate a candidate. So this eliminates the King Caucus. And so we have nominating conventions to 1900. And now today, we use a direct primary where registered voters participate in the primaries to choose who's going to run for the presidency. So what we're seeing here is a trend towards a more democratic nomination system. And so Jacksonian democracy ushers in the convention. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, we'll see the change to direct primary. So if we're looking at this time period, then, we have these very contentious elections, but they do end up with an expansion of democracy. So we have the end of a property requirement to vote, the growth of political parties. So you'd want to talk about conventions versus caucuses, for example. And as we move forward, we're going to learn about Andrew Jackson. And what we want to keep in mind is, was Jackson a champion of the people? Or was Jackson a person who was taking advantage of this democratic swell in society? So stay tuned for that next video on Andrew Jackson. Review your notes. Make sure you have specific information about these two things, and I will see you on the next one.